Hello everyone, Simon Jacobson here. Welcome to another episode of Meaningful Life. Misplaced humility, when pride is a necessity. This program is dedicated by Barton and Sandra Gurewitz in memory of Bernard Leroy Bernie Millman. I remember years ago, I spent a weekend with a relative, an elderly gentleman who was a student back in the 40s in New York. And it was suggested to him, he was like 16, 17-year-old guy, to go and give a public talk for a community in the area where he lived. And he was very shy, and he declined, basically saying it's not for him. He has a brother that's a speaker. He just avoided it. And his mentor, the one who suggested to him, responded to him and said, misplaced humility is rooted in arrogance. That's what he told him. In other words, he was like saying, it's not for me, I'm not really good at it, when in truth, he was afraid to fail or didn't want to try. I remember hearing that line, it just stayed with me. Misplaced humility is rooted in arrogance. And hence this conversation, which I think is very critical in our lives. You know, when we're feigning humility, and we may not even know it ourselves, and when humility is in place. And hence misplaced humility, when pride is a necessity. If you see a crime, God forbid, and we have today videos that demonstrate how people can just walk by a person being trampled by a crowd or by a bicycle or by a car, or they just don't want to get involved, is that considered to be like you don't want to, you're humble and you just don't want to get mixed into some situation, or you're just afraid? You don't want to take a stand. Not every time we don't take a position means that we're being neutral. It could very well be we're being complicit. Let's be very honest. When there's something going that's wrong and you absolutely will not do anything about it, at the end of the day, silence is a form of consent. And tragically, we've seen that in history in some of the worst type of circumstances. We all don't need to be reminded about World War II, Nazi Germany. The silence, as they say in the world of healing, silence is often worse than the rape, than the crime itself. So it's something to really think about when we are in positions. I'll just give an example in my own struggle that I once, I remember encountering. And I deal with this struggle very often. I was once at a restaurant eating a meal, and I noticed a family sitting not far from me at a different table with a few children. One of the children was making a racket, and his father began to berate him. I could see he was like really yelling at him, not loudly, but enough to show there was a lot of anger there. And it was very abusive, to be honest. I was very disturbed by it, because I immediately sensed something's not healthy here. And this was in public, let alone imagine what's going on at home. And I struggled with this. I said to myself, should I go over to talk to this man? You know, don't treat your son that way. And he can easily tell me, who are you? You're a stranger, what do you know? And just basically brush me off. Or worse, he may take it out on his child. And I struggled, had a moral dilemma. Is speaking up going to be healthy or not? So I tried to weigh the two sides, what will really be of benefit. I ended up not doing anything. And I still live with it because I say to myself, you know, for all I know, he's an extremely abusive guy. But then the question is, how far should I go? Let's say I did say something and he would take it not in a positive way or in a positive way. But it's not really, I'm not really correcting the problem. I don't live with them. I'm not going to report them. I haven't investigated what's going on. So these dilemmas come our way very often, and they force us to ask a very important question about ourselves. What are our intentions? Are our intentions to be helpful, or our intentions to protect ourselves? And very often the latter is true, and we don't like to admit it. We don't like to admit it because it makes us uncomfortable. So to ask the question, what is the right thing to do? Not what I like to do, or what makes me comfortable, is really what it comes down to, if you're honest enough. Now, we all know we can play mind games and we can justify our behaviors and come up with all kinds of excuses and all kinds of different ways of explaining our behavior. But we're talking here, obviously, we're trying to have some integrity, some sincerity here of really trying to understand ourselves in a more complete way. So let's talk about this concept. In the Kabbalistic mystical language, there are two attributes, two faculties, you can say, two emotional faculties. If you're familiar with this, great. If not, I'll introduce this idea. According to I like to call the psycho-spiritualists, psycho as in psychological spiritual perspective on things, which is essentially real mysticism, is about, it looks at the human structure, the conscious faculties, as 3 cognitive ones and 7 emotional ones. Conscious, we're talking about the conscious faculties. So the 3 cognitive we're not going to discuss right now. I'll talk about the 7 emotional ones. Amongst them, I want to talk about 2 specific ones. What are the 7 emotional, you could say faculties? Are love, discipline, which is like the antithesis of love, the balance. Then you have compassion. You have determination or drive or conviction. And then its counterbalance is humility, flexibility, yielding. And then the final 2 are foundation or bonding and dignity. So in the Hebrew, I'll say them in the Hebrew: Chesed, Gevura, Teferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchus. I want to talk about Netzach and Hod. Netzach literally means victory, determination, drive, ambition. And we know people who have that blind ambition and often step over everyone in the name of their need to succeed. What is its counterforce that balances it? It's called yielding, flexibility, or humility. Determination that's not balanced by humility will often be very hurtful, can be very aggressive and very very overwhelming. But on the other hand, the question is, when you're a determined person, when do you push forward and when are you flexible? Interesting statement in the Talmud that says, a person should always be flexible, yielding like a reed, and not inflexible and rigid like a cedar tree. That's the expression. Cedar tree being a very powerful tree. And you see, when a storm strikes, what happens? The reed will sway in the wind. It will go with the flow. And a tree can be a very powerful tree, but if the storm is strong enough, it can blow down and a tree because of its rigidity. You ever walk? I remember when we were in camp, we took a hike on a drawbridge. It wasn't a drawbridge, I'm sorry, and a suspension bridge, not a drawbridge, excuse me, a suspension bridge. And I remember the counselor telling us, you feel it shaking? And we got scared. Why did the bridge shake? If it's really solidly based, it should just be really firm. And he said the shaking actually creates a certain flexibility that can actually absorb a lot more weight. So if it's very, very rigid, it can be very strong, but it doesn't quite have that ability to be the dexterity necessary. The same thing if you ever go up on skyscrapers, tall buildings, they sway, not sway as in a very extreme way, but they have a certain flexibility as well in the wind, because the stronger they are, the more they can also create a problem when there's a very strong wind. So it's important to have that balance in architecture and engineering and so on. In psychology, absolutely. But it's not an easy it's not easy to establish when do you need to be rigid and inflexible and unwavering, shall we say, and when to be flexible. And this gets us also back into, because humility can be misunderstood as being weakness. A humble person, is quiet, defers, doesn't always state strong opinion. And today, in our very aggressive world, people sometimes misunderstand humility as weakness. But humility should not be understood as weakness. Humility is not low self-esteem. Low self-esteem is a person who thinks he's worthless, or she thinks she's worthless. Someone that doesn't value themselves. A humble person does value themselves. Why are they humble? Because they realize my gifts are not my own. I was blessed with them. And they recognize their place. So it should never be understood as that. Think of a very intelligent person who chooses to be silent in a debate or an argument. So many people think of silence, as I mentioned before, it's consent. Silence could also be a choice. I'm choosing not to argue this point. I'm choosing my battles. Sometimes you speak, sometimes you have an answer and you don't say the answer. The best teachers, as you grow older and you learn about your great teachers, you learn more from what they didn't say than what they did say. What they said was important, but sometimes the silence, like the white space on a page, can be even more powerful and is more powerful than the black ink on the page. So refrain, has a tremendous amount of power when it's used properly, and it's coming from strength. It could actually take more strength to refrain yourself and restrain yourself than actually to act. If someone has something to say, a strong opinion, and they don't say it, what's more difficult for an intelligent person? To speak up in a situation where he or she has something to say, or to be quiet? It's much more difficult to be quiet. So we need to understand that the idea that this world in which we live in, and there's so much overemphasis on expression, on what appears, appearances, looks, the glamour, the glitz, the sizzle more than the steak. Madison Avenue cynics put it this way: it's not important what happened, it's important what people think happened. Impressions. The biggest cliche of all, the one that nobody follows, which is, don't judge a book by its cover. Everybody judges a book by its cover. That's why it's $1 billion industry, because it sells books. Packaging. The packaging is just as important, if not more important, than the product. Now, sometimes that can be fine because it's a way of selling it, a way of emphasizing its value, but it could also be distorting, where you realize that packaging is far more appealing than the actual product. So in a world of externals and superficiality, it's very easy to misunderstand when you see someone behaving humbly as being weak, when in truth there's a tremendous amount of power in that. So at the end of the day, so how do we determine? So this brings us back to the concept I've shared a number of times, bittul. The concept of bittul. Bittul is a Hebrew word very hard to translate into English, maybe because the language does not tolerate the concept. It's more than modesty and humility. It's more of a suspension of self in order to absorb something greater than yourself. It's when we stand in awe, when we're listening, when we're learning, when we're absorbing. That state, which again can be confused as, one second, oh, don't you have your own opinion? What about your own individuality? Why are you absorbing something greater than you are? But we all understand when you climb a mountain and you see the broader horizon, what you want to do is take it in before you start stating your opinion. You want to first listen, absorb, before you exude and process. So in that context, getting back to the theme that we're discussing here, misplaced humility. When pride is a necessity, the idea of recognizing not what your role in it is, but what has to be done is the first and most important thing. Because if you start talking about your own subjectivity, then you're going to taint the very subject. When you research something, the first thing you want to do is get all the facts. You don't want to say, what does it mean to me? What are the consequences? What are the implications? How is it going to affect me? First, just get those facts. And the same thing in this situation. What is the situation? This situation demands that someone speak up, then it may not be comfortable, but that's exactly what you need to do. That's what humility dictates. And if what's necessary here is that you do not speak up, and you stand aside and defer to someone else, then that's what humility dictates. In other words, it's both coming from a position of strength based on what is needed, not based on what it makes you feel like, whether you're comfortable or not comfortable with it. And if it's something that's necessary, then yes, sometimes you have to sacrifice your own comforts, which means get up and speak and say something. And it's not humility by saying, no, not for me, someone else. That's, as I said before, that's misplaced humility, rooted in arrogance, interestingly. So humility can take on arrogance can take on the shape of humility as well. And it's a critical point idea to speak about, because when you see injustices, you see bullying in schools, at home, in different environments, there are times where it's critical to speak up. But you always want to do it in a productive way, not because you got angry or because you're frustrated. It should come in a deliberate fashion. Let's take an example. I'll use a parenting example or an educational example for those that may not be parents, but in some way we have a situation where we have to discipline someone. So you have a child come home from school, and the same thing could be a student, it can be a colleague, it can be a subordinate, a worker, an employee. They did something wrong. That person did something wrong. And it's established absolutely did something wrong. It's not something like trivial. And you have to address it if you're going to deal with it in a healthy way. So there's some people, no, it can't be my child does no wrong. This person couldn't do wrong. So always blame somebody else. You blame the other person, you blame the principal, you blame the friends, you blame bad influences. Others are ultra-disciplinarians. They immediately hear something like that, right away you ground the child, you punish them. Both are the two extremes that are not necessarily the healthy approach. The right approach, which takes more time and more deliberation and more sensitivity, is to sit down. I'm using the example of a child, but as I said, it can be a worker, it can be anyone. Let's review what happened. And you let your child, you let the person you're dealing with speak up. You don't want to demoralize the person. That's key. You don't want to demoralize them. You want them to grow from it. You want them to show remorse, maybe make reparations, whatever's necessary. And you say, what happened here? Okay. Try to first get the acknowledgement that something was wrong. And let's figure out what to do about it. What would be done? I remember reading, I forgot what book it was. I think it was Swimming with the Sharks by, I forgot who wrote it. It's a very interesting, it was like business advice. It's very cute and very interesting book. And said there that that there was someone who, an employee maybe of IBM, who was a vice president, made a bad decision, and lost the company a lot of money. And we're talking about in the millions. And he for sure thought, that's it, he's going to be axed and fired. He's called in by his superior. His superior sits him down and says, I'd like you to sit in this chair. He gives him his chair. And he sits in the chair of where the subordinate was going to sit. And says to him, you're the boss of this company. You know what happened. What would you do if you were me? And it was like, it was so disarming. Now, he could have, of course, started saying, I'd give him another chance. He said, I'd probably fire him. And then they changed seats, and he says, I'm not firing you. We're not firing you. We see this as a $7 million educational lesson. You've learned on the job. You learned the mistake. And he gave him a certain element of trust, but he definitely made him accountable. He ended up bringing the company in a lot more money. First of all, he learned from it, and he learned also that he was respected. Now, it's case by case. I'm not always saying that's the case. Sometimes a person may need to be fired. The point of the matter is, the focus here was what is the benefit, not our visceral or reflexive reaction. And when you think of it that way, determination and humility and flexibility and yielding can be balanced. And you know when to be firm and when not to be firm, because you're not focusing on your emotional reaction, you're focusing on what is the right thing to do. And this is true across the board. You know, you see things going on today. I hear narratives about the Middle East and others. You know, obviously I'm subjective and I admit that. But sometimes I hear things that are just, I can't just, I try to put myself in the shoes of another approach very different than mine. But then I say to myself, how do you even deal with that when someone has a completely false story? You know, they decide Holocaust denier. What are you supposed to do with that? So in some instances, you just have to let it go and say, this person, forget about it. You know, it's their problem. You're never going to change their minds. And other people, you have to be able to present the case if you see there's an openness. But there's no point in arguing with someone who doesn't want to hear. So it's a part of that is all of that. Now, it's also listening. Sometimes you hear something that I may not have thought of. Maybe it's a different approach. My point is the focus has to be on the constructive result not on the pure reaction. Even though there's no question there are times we need to have a reaction that's appalling. You see something so unhurt, an injustice perpetrated against an innocent person. So it's not like you say, let me hear both sides of the story. We're not sitting in a court of law where you may need to hear both sides of the evidence. Sometimes there's just a reaction. This is just not acceptable. You crossed the line. And the key is not about your comfort. It's the key is what is the right thing to do. And when it comes to that, then it helps you figure out when to be firm and when to so-called let go. Or even the letting go is not letting go, maybe not be the right word, when you need to be more flexible. So humility is a very interesting word and can be quite misplaced and very, very, very often is. And it becomes just another way of masking arrogance. That's what it is. It's not really because you don't want to step up because, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to get hurt. I don't want to fail. I don't want to look bad in the eyes of others. That whole thing, conformity. Why should I stand out? But that's what separates the men from the boys and the women from the girls. That's what separates. That's what makes you into an individual when you're able to make a decision that is true to your moral conviction. And if you need to check, talk to someone else. There's no reason necessarily to be impulsive about it. I'm not talking about an emergency you must act on immediately and then you have to go with your instincts. But check it out. Because generally speaking, when things disturb us or situations come up, thinking about it and waiting and not just reacting is very helpful because then you can look back and say, I still feel, I can't tell you how many emails I've written that I've never sent. An email, something happened, I wrote a sharp, scathing email, and then I decided, you know what, let me not send it. Let me sleep over it, and then the next morning you read it, and you say, okay, I like that I wrote it, but then you don't end up sending it because you realize, not because you just reacted in the moment, because will it benefit? At the moment you felt this is the only ways to protest or to really make a case or really put that person in their place. And it comes down to ultimately stepping back and not just reacting based on our impulses and reflexes, but based also what is the right thing to do. And when you go with that approach and you have that discernment and discipline and deliberation, maybe you can call it the 3 Ds, it helps us come to the decision whether here requires a strong, firm move or requires an element of yielding. Does this require acting or does it require restraining yourself? Very often you'll find that you need to act and you haven't acted or you're afraid to act, not out of humility. It's out of either arrogance or it's out of being comfortable, not wanting to rock the boat, change the status quo. Some food for thought in a world that requires standing up very often for what we believe in. The positions out there, the polarization, character assassination, how people are being canceled, and it's just very painful. And we have to be able to stand up. No, that's not a right thing to do. You may disagree with that person, but don't character assassinate them. Don't eliminate them. Don't take away their dignity. The dignity should never be stripped from someone in that situation, even if you disagree. And I think if we all apply ourselves to this and we keep the balance of the Netzach Chayid balance, the balance of determination, firmness, ambition, with yielding, flexibility, humility, we can all be far more refined people. So, my friends, I hope this was helpful to you. Helpful to me it is, I know, and hopefully you can use it in your life as another life skill from the Meaningful Life Center. Simon Jacobson here. Please, if this was a good message to you, please share with others. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, to our other offerings. Check us out at meaningfullife.com. Share. And of course, I'd love to hear your feedback, your comments, your thoughts. Thank you so much. Be well, be blessed, and be happy. Happy life, a joyous life. Thank you.